extremely productive, engaging day. This is really where we kind of put the flesh and the bones of a lot of the discussions that we've been having, talking about what an actual media policy fit for the 21st century would or should or could look like. We in the Media Forum Coalition have had a stab of this ourselves, which is, I think it's fair to say, one of the most collective pieces of work we've produced, and fairly comprehensive as well. So do pick up a copy if you haven't already. They're floating around. It's fair to say we've got a magnificent panel. It's not an entirely multi-party panel. And I think, to be frank, the reason for that is there is really only one major political party that, at least in recent months and years, has been talking about genuine, radical and progressive reform of the media. But equally, as we've been saying all day, what we value above all else is open, inclusive, democratic debate. So please, when we do open it up to the floor, keep contributions as concise and mutually respectful as possible. OK, so just to introduce the panel, I'll go in reverse order. James Meadway, former chief economist at the New Economic Foundation, chief policy advisor to the Shadow Chancellor. It's fair to say a heavyweight progressive economist. Next, we have Clive Lewis, MP for Norwich North, who is also a former BBC News reporter. So I think it's fair to say that media reform issues are very much at the heart of his politics. We have Kate Osamor MP. Kate's the Labour Cooperative MP for Edmonton, chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Nigeria, as well as the one on Kurds in Turkey. So the Shadow Minister for Women and Equality, Shadow Secretary of State for International Development. It's fair to say has also, I think, been a victim of press harassment and probably press abuse. And I'm sure she's going to speak to that. And finally, who you all know, Dawn Foster. She is a columnist for The Guardian, staff writer for Tribune and Jacobin, writes on politics, social affairs and economics, and a regular commentator on BBC, Sky News Channel 4. I'm going to ask the panellists to speak brief introductions, as we have following the format we've been having on panels in general, and we should have at least half an hour, hopefully, for the floor. But I'll start with Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today to take part in this plenary session. Obviously, as all of you know, I've had a difficult few months when it comes to dealing with the media. And I want to do a little bit of looking back at that today. But given the theme of this session, I also want to look forward, based on my own experiences, at how we can get better at less adversarial, more productive relations between politicians and the media in the future. My first job after university was on the other side of that fence, working with Lord John Bird, the founder of The Big Issue, and working alongside brilliant journalists like the photographer and documentary maker Tim Hetherington, who was so tragically killed while on assignment in Libya during the 2011 civil war. Tim was one of the 43 journalists killed that year while doing their job, a figure that, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, rose to 53 in 2018. And what is most disturbing about last year's numbers is not just the rising number of journalists killed, but that 34 of them were targeted for murder in reprisal of their work, most prominently Jamal Jagoshi. And across the world, from Turkey to Myanmar, from Saudi Arabia to Iran, from Egypt to Cameroon, we are seeing a huge increase in state-authorised repression of journalists. Not helped when the so-called leader of the free world, Donald Trump, refers to the media in his country as the enemy of the people. So we should be grateful to live in a country where the free press is cherished and celebrated and protected. And that is why I am sorry, deeply sorry, in my anger at the media attention facing me and my son 3 months ago when I threw water at a Times reporter, Will Humphreys, and used threatening language towards him. It was totally wrong of me, and I have apologised to Will, and I've paid the price with my job, which was the right thing to happen. Because unlike Donald Trump, I believe our free press is not the enemy of the people, or even the enemy of politicians, but one of the best protections our country has against injustice, unfairness, corruption, and bad government. And I also believe that a free press must include them having freedom to disagree with you, to level difficult questions at you, and to report to their readers what you say. And indeed, it is a great tribute to the media in this country that, like Tim Hetherington, their quest to protect people against injustice and politics against corruption does not stop at the water's edge, but leads them to do fabulous work, groundbreaking journalism work overseas. So it's not just The Guardian's Amelia Gentleman exposing the Windrush scandal in this country. It is also the same paper's Patrick Kingsley investigating the dreadful plight of refugees across whole continents. And Gary Young brilliantly exposing the racism that still persists in modern-day America. But at the same time, we know not everything is perfect with our media. And there is certainly a lot of improvement to be made in terms of the interaction between press and politicians. And we know, as we've seen in the last few years, that the media does not always act in a neutral way and does, of course, sometimes act out some of society's worst traits of privilege, of unchecked power, and of inequality. So let me turn to that issue now. And while many millions of words have been said and written about it in recent years, including the 2,000 pages of the Leveson report, what I would like to do is just make 4 very basic suggestions about what each side could do to improve the way that politics is reported in our country, hopefully in time for the next general election. And let me start with the 4 moves I believe politicians need to make. First, I think there needs to be much greater transparency from politicians, from the Prime Minister downwards, through every government department and their opposition shadow to individual MPs. Simply to say, this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is how I'm trying to achieve it, and if that's what I'm trying to do, then you can make a fair judgment on whether I succeed or not. Rather than what we get at present, which is a whole load of platitudes and uncertainty and spin. In 2017, iNews revealed that a working group from Liam Fox's Department for International Trade had agreed with its US counterparts that their negotiations would remain classified for 4 years after a deal was struck. This disclosure rightfully provoked anger amongst politicians on all benches. Liam Fox faced a common showdown over the government's demand for total secrecy over talks with the US post-Brexit trade deal, accusing the minister of breaking promises to be transparent about the conduct of trade talks. Secondly, our politicians need to be much more accountable. And I don't mean accountable in the sense that I was when I made a mistake and I had to leave my job, although that's important too. But I also mean that we are the people who stand for election. We stand up in Parliament and explain our views, our policies, our decisions, and we stand for election again based on that track record. So it should be the elected politicians who take responsibility for what they do and come out and explain themselves to the media and the public, because the bottom line is MPs are fundamentally accountable to their constituents. And that's exactly as it should be. We just need to look at the woeful lack of accountability from the UK government's political leadership and across the pond on the crisis of climate change. We witnessed on Friday youth strikes taking place across the UK and globally over climate change. Yesterday's strike demonstrated that young people care deeply about environmental issues and will use their collective power to bring about meaningful change. My Labour colleague, Kat Smith, Shadow Minister for Voter Engagement and Youth Affairs, said about the youth strikes, and I quote, "This should serve as a wake-up call to the political establishment that young people's views can no longer be ignored. And urgent action is needed to tackle the escalating ecological crisis." Labour stands in solidarity with young people across the UK who are standing and taking on the government's shameful lack of leadership on climate change. Thirdly, we need to be more open. We need to admit to the media when issues are truly difficult or complicated, or when there are no easy answers, or when things are simply going to take a long time to resolve. And we need to say when things are not a question of yes or no. Because look at some of the biggest problems we've faced over recent years and some of the biggest political mistakes that have been made. And you will see what happens when we're not honest as politicians, when things are complex. Things aren't just yes and no or no. And that's not just about Brexit. It's also when the Home Secretary decides, and I quote, "Yes, of course, all undocumented migrants should be deported." And then we get the Windrush scandal on our hands. And fourthly, with openness comes honesty, and something I also think is sorely lacking in the interactions between politicians and the media, which is our ability as politicians to accept that sometimes you will be asked a question and you will need to say, "I don't know." And that's hard enough thing to do when you're asked about an issue that you haven't come across or which isn't in your brief, but it's even harder when it's an issue you might be expected to know about, or a figure you might be expected to know. But that's when it's even more important to say, "You know what, I don't know," and go and say, "I will look into that." And wouldn't it be better than someone trying to make things up as they go along? But if we make those moves on the political side, I'd hope we could ask the media to make 4 corresponding moves on their side. Firstly, if we're going to be more transparent on our side as politicians and tell the British public, "This is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, this is how I'm doing it, and this is what I want you to judge me on as a politician," then we are willingly giving the media a broad and open target to aim at if they want to question us or criticise us or say we've failed. We all remember when Diane Abbott, the Labour Shadow Home Secretary, had been widely mocked in the media after she struggled to explain how the party would fund their policing policy during the general election. But do you remember when Emma Bartlett from the LBC asked Claire Perry MP the following question? Government departments have given money by the Chancellor to make preparations for Brexit, £4 billion over 3 years. This financial year, government departments have been allocated £1.5 billion for Brexit preparations. So may I start by asking, how much have you been allocated to your department? Miss Perry struggled for an answer and responded, "Gosh, do you know? I actually don't know the amount. But I can tell you we've hired several hundred people over the course of last year." She went on to say she'd look it up, but that it was millions. Was Miss Perry mocked by the media? No. If anything, this gaffe was reasonably unnoticed by the media. Second, if we're going to be accountable as politicians, then I'd ask our media to do the same and hold us all to account in the same way. And don't apply different standards to some of us than others, whether that's based on race, gender, political affiliation, or anything else. And if you think that's already a given, just for a second, remember all the political pundits who held my colleague, Jess Phillips, up as a hero because she falsely claimed to have told Diane Abbott to fuck off, and indeed boasted about doing so in subsequent media interviews, and said she didn't know why more people didn't say that to Diane more often. And now ask yourself how those same pundits would have reacted if Diane had done the same thing, let alone made the whole thing up. Thirdly, if we're going to be more willing as politicians to say, "Well, look, that's not a yes or no answer, it's more complicated than that," then at least, even if the media disagrees with us, I think they should be willing to take that answer on face value, rather than continue to say, "It's a yes or no question, just give us an answer." Because when issues are complex, it does a real disservice to the public to pretend they're not. And as I say, it can lead to major, major mistakes of policy when politicians start believing that themselves. And fourth, how about stop this gotcha style of interviewing? This gotcha culture is a product of a group of people who have spent their whole life obsessed by politics, and particularly target people who are newer to politics, who haven't had the internships of political parties or jobs in government, etc. This has become much more pervasive, not less pervasive, in the age of social media, when everyone wants a clip to go viral on Twitter or Facebook, or Snapchat if you use it. But as attractive as that might be, it is something that is dragging us all down and undermining trust in politics. And we've got to remember it is not us that is looking. It is the public that is looking at these interactions between the media and politicians. And wouldn't it be nice for them to actually hear an interesting debate? Those very few suggested changes I've spelled out would not touch the sides of fixing all the problems, the way our politicians engage, or the problems with our current media in Britain. But I think if we start to address them, we will go some way. I would like to talk a bit more, if I had more time, which I don't, on the way the media report race, and also I would like to talk about the lack of diversity in media. But I think I will leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kate. I'd like to just turn it over to James and really just pick up, if I may, on just one, I think, incredibly important point raised by Dawn. In the last election... Sorry, Kate. Sorry. In the last election, clearly, there was enormous pressure on the Labour Party to produce what I think is widely recognised as one of the most fully costed manifestos ever, and yet very quickly found themselves, or MPs like Kate and particularly Diane, and including John McDonnell, found themselves the victims of this kind of almost blood sport type of journalism, where they were routinely put on the spotlight and asked to recall numbers as if it was some kind of arithmetic test. How do you deal with that?
Okay. You get them to memorise lots of numbers is the sort of short term. And don't let them out until they have. But more seriously, look, there is a fundamental issue here. I think I'm here as a kind of replacement for Matt Zarb-Cousins, which is going to be sort of doubly disappointing. Matt does actually work in the media, and I'm not as funny as him, to be quite honest. But I think I managed to get one joke in to start with, so let's assume the joke has been told, and I can kind of proceed on that grim basis. The more serious answer to that is, why do we end up with a particularly reporting of economics which I'm biased, but I'll tell you it's fundamental really to what Labour has been doing for the last few years, is trying to shift how we talk about the economy, right? And not just how we talk about the economy, what we do about the economy, how we think about the economy, what government is going to do with the economy. And the reason this matters so much is that if you've been on the left for a while, and I think I have been on the left for a while, and other people recognise this, is that for a very long period of time, you weren't really allowed to talk about the economy. It was just this big thing that happened, and the clever people were in charge, and you, because you're on the left, you're a bit thick. So the clever people were in charge, they were going to run it, and everything was fine, and then you hit 2008, and it all collapses. And then, rather strikingly, we hit 2008, it all collapses, and then we sort of run around in circles for about 7 years, until eventually there's a breakthrough getting Jeremy Corbyn elected leader of the Labour Party, on the basis, primarily, of opposing what the government was doing with the economy, and is still doing, which is austerity. And this is where you see a striking failure of how the media operates in this country. Because you don't need to be on the left for many years to think that austerity is a bad idea. You don't need to be one of its many, many victims to think it's a bad idea. Any textbook in the institution we're now sitting in, or any of the other universities around here, any economics textbook will tell you that if you have a massive recession, which is what we had after 2008 in the financial crisis, you do not cut government spending. The reason you don't do this is because you need to keep the economy moving. Like, why do you have a recession? Because loads of people are cutting their spending. That's basically like what's going on here. If the government also cuts its spending, you make the recession worse. So you don't do that. You do the exact opposite of what the coalition government did since 2010. And that is a completely mainstream view of how you run an economy. You know, Paul Krugman, who's not a left-wing figure particularly, sort of centre-left, liberal economist, Nobel, you know, the kind of fake economics Nobel Prize, he won that a few years ago, would come out and tell you this story. So would most of the entire profession. You'd be hard-pushed to find any economist who'd tell you anything different. if they had any fear for their reputation. The one person that George Osborne found was Kenneth Rogoff. It turned out he'd made a spreadsheet mistake in his paper saying austerity would work. So he suddenly, by the way, just last week, turned around and said, you didn't really need to do it anyway. This is the completely mainstream view. Was that ever reflected for years in the media coverage of the economy? No. Almost immediately, or within sort of 12 months or so, it swung into saying, austerity is the thing to do, that's what we're going to do. The entire argument here is what you're going to cut. Oh my God, Labour's run up massive debts. Never mind the fact that these things are happening because there's a global financial crisis. Ignore all that. Labour run up massive debts. What are you going to do? How are you going to cut things? Right? And that has remained the argument. And this is where you get this inane fixation of how we talk about the economy as if only two things mattered. One, the debt, which they mean the government debt, and two, the deficit, by which they mean the government's deficit. And these two numbers, which you're supposed to memorise, which John mostly did. There you go. That's me proving my worth for 3 years. I should say I don't work for him anymore, which is why I'm allowed to be here and say whatever the hell I like for a bit. But it's a fixation on these two numbers as if they're the only things that matters, and to hell with everything else that might be happening to the economy, like for the fact that average wages in this country is still below what they were in 2010. Like the fact that investment has fallen right the way across the country. Like the fact you've got great swathes of the country where you can wander around, you can see the damage that now 30, 40 years of neoliberalism has done. Is that discussed in any serious way by our media? No, it is not, because they have a fixation on austerity and a fixation on these two numbers. And that's what it becomes. And that's the entirety of the argument that we're allowed. And what was so brilliant, and has been so brilliant, I think, over the last few years, has been the way in which having Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party and John as Shadow Chancellor and then a Shadow Cabinet and then an entire movement around him has been able to break through that and offer something different. Because people might remember when the manifesto in 2017 was leaked. And it was leaked, I assume, I'm hoping not revealing a big secret here, we didn't do it ourselves. Some people said that, but we're not that Machiavellian, frankly. It was leaked, I think, with the intention of damaging what Labour was doing, what Jeremy and everybody else was standing for. And he was presented all over the Telegraph with this kind of glee, rubbing their hands. Oh my God, they're actually going to nationalise the railways. They're going to nationalise water. They're going to put up taxes on rich people. They're going to make university education free. Look at this, everyone. Which is doing a brilliant job of publicising loads and loads of stuff that's really, really popular for us. And after about 2 days, this sinks in. But it was intended to damage us because what it said was so far out of what you were allowed, what polite company said about the economy, which by this point we reduced to two numbers and support for austerity. It was so far out of that they couldn't even, I don't think the middle of British politics, the middle of British media, could even conceive of any kind of economics that might be different to that, let alone it was popular. And you knew it was popular because for years people have been saying they were very happy to see the railways renationalised. 80% of public support for measures like this. For years they've been saying this and been completely ignored. So it was brilliant to crack through that. And I think there's a lesson here for what we do next, which is sort of wrapping up on this point, which is that we can pat ourselves on the back about what happened in 2017. It will not be possible to sort of, when the next election turns up, it could be soon, it's probably more likely to be 2022. I hate to depress you all, but, Theresa May has that kind of clinging on kind of look about it. But either way, it's not... Either way, it's not going to be possible to photocopy the 2017 manifesto and hand it out again, perhaps with some of the numbers updated, right? We have to do something different. And my own personal belief is that the media we have is so battered and so damaged, but also so distrusted. The institutions that matter for how we talk about the media now are not the ones that mattered 10 or even 5 years ago. So it's Facebook, it's Twitter to a lesser extent, it's the big data companies, all of which are updating their own business models to cope with the world and the public space that they helped create. And it's my belief that by 2022, questions like this will become absolutely central on the doorstep of anybody who's asking you about it. Which means, and I freely admit that this is a kind of Labour Party-focused contribution on my part, but I happen to think that getting Jeremy Corbyn elected Prime Minister is a critical thing that we should all be doing, and we ought to be doing whatever we can to make that happen. But it means that in terms of how we're going to change this society, this economy, the way in which media companies operate, which means the big data companies, which means Facebook and all the rest of them operate, and what we do about that new public digital sphere is going to be absolutely central, which is why discussions like the one people have had today and the Media Reform Coalition, all the rest of it, isn't just a sort of fringe issue that we can talk about over here that isn't really central to what we're doing in politics. It's my belief that all of these issues, particularly around the digital economy and the way in which digital media is influencing people's lives, is going to very rapidly become a doorstep issue over the next few years. You can see some of it already with the Cambridge Analytica scandal at Facebook. You can see already this rising public sense. And how we answer that, and I think the mechanisms of answering that have to be the ones that people have talked about, which is how you democratize the provision of these very, very large infrastructure companies, these very, very large companies that produce this new public space. How we claim some ownership and control over what we're doing. How we set up something like, which was in Jeremy's Alternative McTaggart lecture last year, how we set up something like a British Digital Corporation to help sustain that public democratic space, I think will move absolutely centre stage in terms of what progressive politics looks like in this country over the next few years. So I think what we're doing here today, and what you're all doing here today, is going to become absolutely central to an understanding of what the left is and what it's doing and how we start to present a vision of the future, which isn't fixated on getting politicians to behave like speak-your-weight machines, but instead talks about the kind of society we want to build, the role that media can play in this, how we democratise the economy, these big issues that matter to people, and how we get to some answers that people will like, respect, and want to vote for. Thank you.
Clive, the BBC has long been thought of amongst some in the left as a force for democratic good. Increasingly, that's been questioned. Is there any prospect for a BBC that could address the kinds of failures that James has spoken about?
I will come to that very shortly. First of all, James, I'm on the Shadow Treasury team, and I can tell you now that the deficit is 43.6 billion, and the national debt is 1.8 trillion. Because it is going, so you were doing your job right. It's ingrained on my brain. Because no one wants to go on television and have that pub quiz, you're a fool because you don't know these figures, which has happened to some of my colleagues. And so you try and stack up on all these stats, which, to be quite frank, no one ever remembers, and most people don't care about. What they care about is what their life is actually like, what the point is you're trying to make, rather than reading off endless stats and statistics. It's taken me about 3 years to realise that. But I do remember those two. So you are doing your job. You did do your job very well, James, and it's ingrained into my brain on a monthly basis. I think our media works and is fit for purpose. I'm sorry to shock you all. We have a media that is fit for the political economy that we inhabit. So if you think about that, we have a media system that works quite well in the political and economic system it's designed for, because it's maintaining it. That's what our media does. It keeps that system going. It perpetuates it. It strengthens it. And if there are forces, be democratic or not, on the left or not, that challenge or threaten that, then our media responds accordingly. And that's the media that we have at the moment. It's geared up. Both the BBC and the corporate side is geared up to basically hold the current economic and political system in place. It hasn't always been that way. I mean, if you look at the history of the BBC, there was a period in the BBC where the BBC was far more statist than it currently is. It's far more corporatized now. And what do we want to see happen if there is a radical Labour government? Well, I don't want to see it going back to being a statist BBC. I would like to see it becoming a democratic BBC. And I think some of the changes that are recommended for the BBC in here are pretty good. And there's a reason for wanting to democratise the BBC. I think there's going to be a real need for it. One of my job on the shadow cabinet, wishful thinking, my job on the shadow front bench, is sustainable economics. And one of the things that is becoming increasingly clear now, and I think after Brexit, this will probably, take up far more news space than it currently is, far more of the public attention than it currently is, although I think it is beginning to seep in, is the issue of climate change and biodiversity breakdown. If you think Brexit, which has been poorly served by not just politicians, but also the media as well, in terms of giving us the facts to be able to respond and act accordingly, let's not forget, the media is meant to be the so-called fourth estate. It's meant to inform all of us to be able to participate fully in our democracy. Well, it's not doing that, unfortunately. And when you look at what's coming down the road in terms of climate change and the systemic shocks which will hit our economy, it will make Brexit look like a breeze. So that's why we need to have a democratized media system which is actually responsive and allowing our democracies to formulate the policies that we actually need to confront the issues that we all know are coming and need addressing. So why is it that when you turn your TV on, when I worked in the BBC, why is it when I turned my TV on, when I worked at the BBC, when I did my job, why was it that I was constantly aghast at the almost, as James has said, almost seemingly daily diatribe about austerity being necessary? The actual media commentators would laugh at you if you had dared to question austerity. You don't buy into austerity. Your credibility was shot to shit, basically, if you tried to question it. And it was an assumption. So that editorialization, that inbuilt assumption, basically negated any real prospect of any alternative political thought on the issue. Some people tried, but they were marginalised. And I know it. I remember seeing colleagues in the BBC who kind of would say, what are you on about? We've got to pay the debt off. Well, I think everyone now understands basic economics 101, that trying to pay the debt off by shrinking the economy isn't really a good idea, which is what we were doing. It was really a case of the emperor's clothes. And to be quite frank, it wasn't until Jeremy Corbyn came along and actually challenged that we began to see that being questioned. And now, who in the media makes the assumption that austerity is the only way forward? It's kind of quietly died a death, you know. So I think James was on to some really good points. But so to come back a little bit to the issues for climate change and those systemic shocks, one of the things I think I am beginning to understand is that we are going to have to build resilience into not just our economy, not just our infrastructure, but also our democratic and civil infrastructure. Look, 1 million people are on the move in the Mediterranean after the Syrian civil war and the collapse of Libya. 1 million people. The United Nations says if we're on target on our current carbon trajectories to see by 2050 anything between 1 and 3 billion people on the move, climate refugees on the move. 1 and 3 billion people by 2050. Look what's happened to Europe in terms of the rise of fascism, the rise of racism and xenophobia, of authoritarianism, of literally almost the breakup of the European Union that might happen this week, from our point of view. But literally the breakup of the on 1 million people on the move. Look what the forces that has unleashed in Europe. Look at how that has destabilized democracies across the Western world, in South America as well. So I would argue that if we are actually going to ensure that we can build resilience into our democracies, given the systemic shocks that we know are coming, even if we get greenhouse gases down, even if we can tackle biodiversity loss in the timescales that we're talking, some of those systemic shocks are going to be coming. We need to have a democracy that is resilient. And to have a resilient democracy, you need a media that is fit for purpose and questioning and challenging those politicians who are not prepared to step up and tackle the existential threats that are facing us, the corporations that are playing their part in ensuring that an existential threat doesn't just happen, but is speeding along towards it. So that's the kind of media I want to see. And that's not about handing it over to left-wingers, as Danny Finkelstein accused me on Twitter a little while ago when I talked about, God, please, hurry up, we need to reform the BBC. The assumption of a raft of media commentators was that I was talking about basically handing it over to some commissar with a red star on his cap. You know, I was actually talking about handing it over to licence fee payers and BBC staff. Those are the reforms that I wanted to see. And what happened? I was sneered at and told I was a complete redhead, red left-wing command and control maniac. So, you know, look, that's why I think we need to see that really deep-rooted reform of media, because without that, we will have a political system and an economy that isn't fit for purpose. And with the changes that are approaching, I can't see any solution where the media that isn't reformed can play its part. And I'll just finish very quickly on methodologies of journalism. I'm not sure if that's been part of what the day has been about. But I think that journalism school and the schools that teach journalism, which is done through the NCTJ, the National Council of Training for Journalists, although there are other organisations that teach, I think there needs to be a real root and branch review of how journalism is taught. Because journalism at the moment has become pretty much well, this mad raving fascist over here that wants to kill everyone has said this. What's your view on this over on this side? It's the two are not equal. Okay, the two are not equal in a civilized society. We're going to have to move away to a position, I think, where journalism is going to ask tough questions, but also accept there's a public interest. What is the public interest? The public interest is not stoking racism, Islamophobia, and fascism and allowing people to get away with it in the name of impartiality. Well, look, the world is coming to an end. This person doesn't think it's actually happened, despite 99% of scientists thinking that it is. What do you have to say about that, Clive? Look, don't invite the scientist, don't invite that guy on because he's talking out of his arse. It's the equivalent of asking someone to come on to defend cigarette smoking, in my opinion. So I think there's going to have to be a kind of review, if you want, of how journalism itself is conducted and how it's taught. And what impartiality actually means and what it's about. And I think that's something that we could talk about a bit more. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Dawn, you have the privilege of the last word.
There's a scene in Brass Eye where Chris Morris is walking through a park and he's interviewing a man in a suit. And the man is a paedophile and explains at length why he's a paedophile and why paedophiles have been unfairly maligned by the press, and explains all of his views and why he does what he does. And that's seen as absurd and ludicrous. Anyway, last night, Newsnight decided that the best response to 49 Muslims being killed in Christchurch was to interview a fascist without anybody else in the panel. So that's currently where we're at. Brass Eye increasingly just looks like a documentary, and you wonder, how you begin to realise that Chris Morris doesn't work anymore because he can't parody things. I'm a political journalist, but I am somewhat of an outsider in that I do things other than just report gossip that people text me. I wasn't technically considered a political journalist until Jeremy Corbyn got elected. So even though I spent all of my time writing about the effects of austerity on people, I spent all of my time around the country speaking to people in food banks, to single mothers who were homeless, to people who to people who had absolutely nothing left, who were disabled, who had been told that they were fit for work when they were stuck on a ventilator. That wasn't considered politics. It was considered some kind of obscure societal sort of journalism. And me and a lot of other people who were arguing that austerity didn't make sense economically, but also, even in the short term, like if you kick somebody out of their home to save a small amount of money for a local council, the amount of money that they then cost homelessness services booms incredibly. I personally think everybody should have a good standard of living and that we are rich enough to afford that. Conservatives don't, but you can sometimes argue with them that a short-term saving will, a short-term saving causing, long-term, suffering can work that way. But I remember 2015 when Ed Miliband lost, and I was mocked for saying that I thought the Conservatives would win. It was really interesting when Jeremy Corbyn got elected, because all of a sudden my phone started buzzing a lot, because lots and lots of political journalists suddenly realised that their contact books were practically empty. And I suddenly got loads of text messages going, have you heard of this person called Cat Smith? And I was like, yes, of course, I've known her for 9 years. I suddenly realised that every single journalist in Westminster had a very, very small number of people they took out for dinner that they got all of their stories from. And they had completely thrown their lot in with the wrong people. They had no idea about the general feeling of the country. They had no idea about how many people were angry about austerity. They had no idea how many people hadn't voted Labour, not because they were right-wing, but because Labour were too right-wing for them now. And that eventually began to catch up with a lot of people, but unfortunately the way that Westminster reported didn't change at all. So I think one of the big problems with political journalism is that it involves a lot of people sat around in desks in the House, in the House of Commons, who don't spend a lot of time outside there. They definitely don't go around the country apart from, you know, very, very small photo shoots. I particularly enjoyed the recent one with Theresa May in front of a load of pallets, where she looked as though somebody had just suddenly discovered her in a warehouse. And that's pretty much the only time that Westminster journalists get out. And I've spent the last week stood on College Green, freezing my arse off in front of cameras. And often I'm asked questions and I don't know the answer and I just have to bluff. And it's not helpful for the public. It doesn't tell them anything. It's just filling airspace when we could be talking about a lot of other things. And there are, you know, there are so many things wrong with the media. And one of the big problems is that politics is treated as gossip. It's treated exclusively as happening in Westminster. People point scoring over each other, when actually politics happens in people's lives every single day. On Thursday, I spent most of the day looking at the fallout from the Bloody Sunday announcements, where one soldier was charged for two killings when, you know, the Savile inquiry found that he killed 4 people and injured, you know, at least 4 more. And there was very little attention really paid in Westminster to the Bloody Sunday inquiry, even though it had a huge resonance for a huge number of people. Instead, we were focused on what was happening in Westminster, what amendment was going through, etc., etc. I saw a huge number of political journalists tweeting about the fact that Mark Francois apparently pronounces the letter H as H, not H. And that was deemed worthy of reporting and mockery by some, you know, journalists who've clearly never left London or Oxford, because that's not how we pronounce it. And it's an increasing problem that nobody can really understand, that politics is changing, the world is changing, Britain especially is changing, and everything is still focused as if we are in the 90s, and politics is exclusively about who can, you know, who can win a small argument on the Radio 4 Today programme, which is the worst thing in the world, to be honest. And I think one of the things that really, really bugs me, and Jeremy Corbyn has been very, very good at spinning this round, is that Prime Minister's questions is a complete waste of time. It is an utter waste of time. You never get a proper answer. Almost nobody watches it. And everybody in Westminster acts as if it's a focal point of the weekend, as if it changes anything, as if anybody ever learns anything from it. And one thing I did like was that Jeremy Corbyn started bringing questions from the public, saying, this person has been affected by X. What do you say to them? And Theresa May would make some stupid joke and some stupid quip. What was the most recent one? Some crap about meerkats.
Simples.
Oh, God, yeah. And the general public don't care. I mean, I'd never watched Prime Minister's Questions until I started working for a newspaper that I'd never read until they gave me a job. I did actually tell the editor that once. My first job at The Guardian was as a comment moderator. I'd never read The Guardian because they don't sell it in Newport. And I've literally never bought a copy. Can't wait to get sacked. But it's a huge... I mean, nobody cares about Prime Minister's Questions, apart from a very, very small number of people who throw all of their resources at it. And what we need more of is people getting out, speaking to people in the general public, speaking to people whose lives have been affected by universal credit, by poverty, by austerity, etc. And actually, the conversation around austerity has changed, but the mainstream media won't accept that. So even though we accept now that austerity has caused a huge amount of harm, that austerity has completely screwed up the economy, nobody is saying this. So even though when me and other people would say austerity isn't working, austerity isn't the way forward, we were mocked, we were, you know, we were told that we didn't understand economics. Even though the conversation has changed, and even right-wing commentators now accept that austerity isn't working and it isn't the way forward, everybody pretends it's not still happening. It is still happening. Philip Hammond doesn't say very much because he's an extraordinarily boring man, but he is still inflicting austerity, and you know, the Conservatives have tried to pretend that with the exit of George Osborne, austerity has ended. It's still ongoing. It's still ongoing. It's still causing huge amounts of harm. We're seeing universities collapse. We're seeing Conservative councils collapse. We're seeing massive deficits in councils everywhere. And, the mainstream media don't accept that the vast majority of the public now understand that austerity has not worked. So even though the conversation has changed, we still don't see it reflected. And I think, there is that huge problem where we don't see our reflection in the media. It makes a change to be on a panel where, it's not just Oxbridge accents and then me with my flat vowels. And I've really enjoyed that for once. But nobody sees themselves reflected in the media for the most part. And when you speak to people in the media about this, you get two responses. One, I get, people like me, people like Owen Jones, people who are left-wing in the media are constantly told that we're not real journalists, we're activists. So even though people who are far more right-wing than me and Owen Jones are left-wing constantly espouse their views, they're seen as moderate, they're seen as neutral, whereas anybody to the left is constantly seen as an activist. So you can be you can be Julia Hartley-Brewer as Islamophobic as you like. She's not seen as an activist, she's seen as a legitimate commentator. And you get so many right-wing journalists who are members of the Conservative Party. They're often advising the Conservative Party. Some of them are writing centrist manifestos behind the scenes. And they're seen as neutral. But left-wingers are constantly seen as activists and constantly discredited and constantly attacked. And the other thing is that we're constantly told that left-wingers live in an echo chamber. Growing up, most people I knew were relatively left-wing because it turns out if you live in poverty, you don't want to vote Tory for the most part because you'll just get screwed over. We saw what happened in Northern Ireland. We saw what happened in, the miners' strike. We understand what happens when the ruling class are in power. But when you speak to Westminster commentators, they genuinely believe that the vast majority of the public would vote centrist when nobody would. Nobody would. And so, you have this tiny Westminster echo chamber who constantly tell everybody outside of them who, is pro-Corbyn or anti-austerity that they are in this bizarre echo chamber. And I think, to be honest, the only way forward is to break up Westminster reporting. Too much emphasis is placed on Westminster and on what MP is saying what about somebody else. But also the biggest thing is that workers' rights need to really, really change in journalism. We have way too many freelancers. We have way too few local papers. Increasingly newspapers' budgets are getting tightened. And that hurts women. It hurts people of colour. It hurts younger people. And it means that local areas do not have coverage of what's going on in their area, and it means that increasingly the only people who can afford to break into the media are white middle-class people who have parents who will bankroll them. And what does that do but perpetuate increasingly tedious middle-class centrist view, which then claims that they represent the entire country. If we want a representative media, we need to focus on workers' rights and really, really broadening out journalism, and we really, really, really need to invest in local journalism. And since that as we all know, we can't rely on the market, so it has to come from the state. The state have to properly focus on making sure that local media is properly supported. Otherwise, we don't have representation whatsoever.
Thanks. Thank you very much for all those fantastic contributions. So fantastic that we officially only have 5 minutes for floor discussion, but we can possibly push that slightly. In any case, we can certainly continue it in SOAS immediately afterwards, where the party is. But let's just take one round, if we can, I'll just take a handful of very, very quick contributions. Have we got the roving mics? We have Mark at the back. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. Perfect.
Mark Wadsworth, and I'd like to thank the Media Reform Coalition for very kindly making me one of its case studies in the report on anti-Semitism and the coverage of Jeremy Corbyn. And in that report it demonstrated that only one publication, The Independent, took the rudimentary job of asking me for my side of the story. And as Clive will tell you as a fellow journalist, the first thing we're taught as a tenant of journalism in journalism school is that you get the other side of the story, especially when the story is as tendentious as the story that I was involved in, where I've suffered fake news. And most recently, that book, that disgusting hatchet job by Tom Bauer, Dangerous Hero, has been mentioned on 3 pages. I'm libelled in there on the question of the VS, so my libel lawyers are onto that. What's this space? My question to the panel is this. Kate, you've been demonised as a black woman. Diane Abbott is the most abused person on social media. Death threats, I won't even go into it. Just Google it and you'll see it for yourself. We have to support each other. My question is, how do we fight back and get a fair hearing in the mainstream media? We shouldn't have to rely on Peter Oborne, a right-wing libertarian, in the Mail on Sunday, to expose the lies in the Bauer book, both about Jeremy and me. What do we do to get a fair hearing?
Okay, can those 4 people... Yeah, we've got two over here. And was there one other? And sorry, the gentleman, but yeah, just behind. Okay.
Since the last general election, in particular, we're seeing more left voices breaking into broadcast media, and Dawn, you talked about that a bit. But I'm often left quite frustrated by the way, you've talked about how people are framed, invited on, but framed as being fundamentally legitimate. A lot of the most powerful moments for me, watching figures on the left on broadcast media in the last few years, have been when people have broken the 4th wall. I'm thinking of when John McDonnell directly addressed the camera on The Mars Show, Owen Jones walking off Sky News because they refused to acknowledge any homophobic element of the Orlando shootings, or Ash Sarkar yelling, "I'm a communist, you idiot," at Piers Morgan. I often think that a good tactic for people would be to explicitly question the biases or the motives of the questioners. I think actually the public, I think a lot of these journalists think, oh, everyone hates politicians. I don't know about you, but I have far more rancor towards a lot of journalists now than a lot of politicians. And I speak as someone who was and still is a journalist. But obviously the response to explicitly questioning in such a way might well be for people to not be invited back on. I just wondered if the panel think that this sort of breaking the 4th wall, this explicit questioning, could be a useful tactic for the left, if you should do it more, what the consequences might be.
Thanks. Lady here and the gentleman back there. One minute.
Hi. Yes, I think Dawn Foster touched on something really, really important, which is the support of the state for some different kind of media that is local. And I really urge you to look at the Venezuelan case. Everybody talks about Venezuela being a dictatorship and not having freedom of expression. Go there and you will see an explosion of alternative media that's connected to communities that have received the support of the state at the beginning, but after that, the local community is the one that supports and feeds and uses these kind of outlets, and it's been a success. I go there and I just think, my God, why people don't know this about why they don't study this case. That is the clue, really. A bit of support of the state at the beginning, but really the communities will take it forward.
Thank you very much. And
thank you. I'd just like to touch upon one of the things that was talked about, and that is how we talk about things. In particular, the gross reductive language used to trivialise our lives. Which I believe is a consequence of the neoliberalist market. In particular, for example, Brexit, which will have far-reaching implications for us, perhaps devastatingly for marginalised communities. So Brexit is typically referred to as deal. And I hate that expression because our lives, my life, shouldn't be just reduced to a deal. I think that perhaps has maybe a collective psychological effect on all of us. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, and particularly Kay as a politician, because they refer to it as the deal, and then if you go take by the press as the deal, I think my life and our lives are effectively worth more than just being reduced in such a trivialised manner.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond to those questions and wrap up their contributions in 30 seconds. But before I do that, two just very important announcements in case I forget, which I'm liable to. Firstly, thank you to everyone who's come today, who's made contributions both from panels and the floor. It's been an incredibly illuminating, inspiring day. We usually say at the end of these events, the usual kind of contact your MP, join our mailing list, phone into radio programs, etc. But we're actually just going to focus on one very important to-do item, which is to debate the model motion, which is in your conference pack or available at the registration desk, in your party, in your union, in your branches, in your organisations, to support the MediaManifesto. And lastly, as I've just mentioned briefly before, we are having a party immediately after this where I hope those of you who don't get a chance to raise a question here will be able to engage in discussion more informally. It's at the SOAS JCR, which is just across the square. You can just follow the hordes of people. If any of the security asks you, just say you are with the Media Democracy Festival and flash your magic wristband. So if we can just start perhaps from James and work our way back to Dawn.
30 seconds. Well, I'll just pick up on the last question there, which helpfully wasn't, and it's helpful for me, wasn't really about the media at all, so that's good, thank you. The specific on that, I think you're absolutely right. First, in two parts. One, the effect of Brexit, and I think it's underestimated how bad this has been. It's been a really sort of psychologically traumatic experience for an awful lot of people, that's just true. If you take the status of EU migrants, and this is where the deal thing really rankles, the status of EU migrants in this country, the idea, even the thought that the government could somehow use the rights of these people as a bargaining chip with the EU is absolutely abhorrent. It is absolutely disgusting to put people through the levels of uncertainty and fear about their future that this government has put them through in the last few years as a bargaining chip against the EU, which didn't even fucking work, right? That's the main thing here, the sheer ineptitude with which our would-be ruling classes approached its negotiations with the EU is extraordinary to behold. At every single step of the way, they've miscalculated, and that is a large reason why we're in this mess now. And that mess is fixed on the deal that Theresa May has presented. Now, speaking personally, I could not imagine, if you take my personal preferences, a worse deal that could ever be written than the one that Theresa May has managed to cook up. At the centre of it, it does almost nothing other than end freedom of movement. Every single other thing that could be sold out has been sold out in that. Every single other possibly desirable part of the EU that could exist is being trashed because of that. It does nothing to do to take back control, to bring sovereignty or whatever it might be back to this country. It does none of these things. She sacrificed everything, to try and get a deal that ended freedom of movement, does nothing else. With a PS, by the way, that the state aid and competition law restrictions, the stuff that could clamp down on the future left-wing government here, are much tighter than they are under the current provisions. So the deal is an absolute abomination. There is no way, under any circumstances, that anybody who thinks themselves to be progressive in any sense could ever want to vote for this thing. And I sincerely hope that as many Labour MPs as there are vote against it when she inevitably drags it back for a reading next week. We should make as a point of principle freedom of movement and not think that we can treat people as a bargaining chip.
Thank you. Clive, your 30 seconds starts now.
That answer reminds me of Nixon. He came into press conference. Does anyone have any questions for my answers? And that was a very good answer. On the means of production, on the issue of communities, I think the next level, the next stage in journalism is going to include the technologies which I think are transforming and, basically transforming the way that we consume and produce our media. We are all potentially now citizen journalists. You know, the advent of our mobile phones. The internet means that we can all broadcast. Look at Novara Media. I mean, it's done on more than a mobile phone, obviously, but that means get myself in trouble there. But that means that basically we can all, communities ourselves, we can all begin to contribute and have a say on that. But we do still need capital investment, and that's something which I think the next Labour government can look closely at, because I think we see whether it's on energy production, whether on the media, so many areas. I've been heckled by a sneeze. We can see technology opening up and potentially democratising. Technology can go two ways. It can go the wrong way or it can go the right way, and we'd like to see it go the right way. Mark, to your question, how do we ensure that what happened to you, what's happened to others, what's happened to Kate, how do we ensure that it stops and changes when we elect a democratically socialist government that will come in with a radical agenda and change that? That's how we change it. And that's the main way that I'll be working towards making sure that that happens. On the issue of tackling the kind of fourth wall, I mean, I think you're right. I think tackling the media assumptions that are kind of commonplace. I was doing a piece of media the other day, and it's only afterwards I realised they were saying to me, well, you know, look, the left captured the NEC. The left captured the General Secretaryship. And I thought to myself, no, actually, they were democratically elected. They were voted in. They didn't capture anything. They were voted in. And it's that language, that subtext, which I think then poisons the well. And I have challenged. Nick Robinson put on a Vox, and it was on Syria, and it had leading questions from the journalist. And the only reason I knew what a leading question was because I had been a journalist who perhaps done it myself. But a leading question is where, and it said, do you think Jeremy Corbyn was wrong to oppose bombing Syria? And so these three Voxes were all hostile, including the leading question. And I said to Nick, how can you call that an impartial Vox? Your journalist was putting forward leading questions, and he kerfuffled and he said I was wrong. And I said, don't tell me. I was a journalist for 12 years at the BBC. Don't tell me. I know what a leading question is. What happened? The producers phoned me up afterwards and said we're really sorry. And they put out the other Voxes that were more supportive. But that only happened after I'd kicked off on air. So I think you're right to challenge that. And finally, I would say as a model for how you can see the impact of good journalism. David Attenborough and The Blue Planet wasn't journalism. But look at what it was able to do in just one series in terms of informing the public about plastics and what we're doing to our world. That should be the standard that all journalism in this country operates to. If one programme can make that much difference to the public perception of what's happening, think what all of the news media itself, if it was geared and aimed in that direction, what it could achieve. So I think that's the standard.
30 seconds. Mark, your question, without a shadow of a doubt, is really, really important. And, you know, I send my solidarity to you because you have personally been through a very difficult time. And watching it as a new politician, you know, a black woman, you know, I look at what you're going through. I look at what Diane goes through. And I think sometimes what happens is the way that Diane is described, the respect is not there. Diane is the first black MP that was elected to Parliament on both sides. So she should be seen as a queen. I'm sorry. Yeah? But what we see is that she's continually interrupted when she's on television. She's minimised. She is treated as someone who hasn't got any agency. She's nobody. And I see that, and I think for someone who's been in Parliament for so many years and she's been treated like this in Parliament as well, in the chamber, the way that she's heckled. Sometimes I'm in my office and I see Diane is about to speak in the chamber. I will rush into the chamber because I feel like I have to sit with her because she's not even allowed to speak in the chamber. So that's just one side. And then on the other side, it's how she's treated in the media. And obviously Amnesty International did that report to show that during the general election, she was the most abused MP, you know, on Twitter. And we know this is happening. We see it. How does that make other young women of colour want to come forward and put themselves in the same position as Diane? And there's so much work that needs to be done. And I think we need to accept that the mainstream media is not the place right now for that to take place. So we're relying on what they will class as alternative. It's not alternative. It's the media that will actually allow our voices to land, to explain, and to have agency. Because there are so many young people out there who are relying on us to be able to do that job. And at the moment, we're not allowed to do that job. We're not allowed to get our voice out. you made a very interesting point when you said that our story is not given the same agency as the story that's attacking us. So when I was going through what I was going through with my son, I was never asked what my story was. Nobody ever came to me and said what actually happened. So what ended up happening, it was just one narrative that was running, and that's all everybody read. And that needs to stop, because that isn't journalism. It's barbaric. It was harassment, which I went through. But I responded in a certain way towards another person, so I had to apologise for that action. But that doesn't talk, that evades the bigger question about the way the media comes for us. And that does really need to be spoken about.
I'll try and keep 30 seconds. On Juliet's question on the fourth wall, I agree it's really, really good when it happens. I think the main reason it doesn't happen more is because people on the left are in particularly precarious positions. I'd love to do it more. My landlord would then kill me because I couldn't be able to pay my rent. But also, I mean, like behind the scenes as well, a lot. Like every now and then I put my neck out and criticise another journalist for doing something like, for instance, in a Guardian article, quoting a tweet by a bloke who spends most of his time attacking Diane Abbott in a racist way, who made up a quote that Jeremy Corbyn said that was reported in a Guardian article as something that Jeremy Corbyn had said verbatim. And when I mentioned that, I got a very threatening email from the journalist responsible. I've had another colleague block me for tweeting critically about Theresa May. There's a lot of things behind the scenes that that underline to you over and over again that, you know, I'm 31, I've worked in journalism for about 8 years now. I still do not have a permanent contract anywhere. I'm completely freelance. Like, often my bank account is completely empty, and I know that, you know, if I piss one person off, I probably can't pay my rent next month. And I think that that is the main thing that is stopping a lot of people. And if you're right-wing, it's a lot easier to get paid because there are a lot more right-wing newspapers. And it's a lot easier to get a contract. Whereas if you're left-wing, A, you're attacked more, and B, you're in a much more precarious position, and you know over and over again that people are circling like vultures. And on the point on language and Brexit, completely agree. One thing that's endlessly annoyed me is that people still refuse to understand Northern Ireland and the Irish border. They will not understand how the border interacts in people's lives, that people walk their dogs over it. It's only talked about in business terms. And, you know, you get endless journalists say to me, like, can't you just carry a passport? And it's like, why should you have to carry your passport to walk to your local pub? Why should you have to carry your passport to walk your dog? Why should you have to get your children to carry their passports when they go to school in the morning? People just, you know, point blank will not accept the realities of Brexit, and it's reported in such a stupid point-scoring way that, you know, it's just beyond a joke.
Thanks again to all the panellists, all of you. I think if there's one message that rings true from this session and the day in its entirety, is that there can be no genuine programme for progressive reform of anything without a programme of progressive media reform. Thanks very much.
You know what? When I see a moustache like that, like Justin's wearing, I always think it's November. When I see someone with like Justin's moustache, you see his moustache? I always think